My name is Veronica Lippincott, and I am Adjunct Associate Professor of Geography here at Hofstra, and I also direct our Africana Studies program. And I also serve as Associate Director of our Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice. And I'm pleased to collaborate with many people in this room for this wonderful event. And first off, I'd like to thank our organizer, Benita San Pedro Vizcaya, as well as the co-sponsors for this event, the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, the Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice, the Africana Studies Program, and of course, the Hofstra University Cultural Center for making this event possible. Enrique Okenve's visit is made possible thanks to a collaboration with Espacio de Culturas at New York University's King Juan Carlos I Center, and the center's director, Jordana Mendelsohn. And just worth noting, tomorrow, Enrique Okenve will deliver a lecture at NYU at 6 p.m. And the title of his talk is Behind the Gaze, Spanish Power and Fang Humiliation in Equatorial Guinea. And so for some context, for the Fang, first their cultures and bodies were vilified. Then came the consequent and subjugation of Fang men and women who were never accepted, and the many forms of Spanish colonial power. So Enrique Okenve will be speaking on that. Now, to introduce our speaker, Enrique Okenve teaches African history and research methods in the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies, the Mona campus in Jamaica. A child of the Nzomo clan and Africa's post-independence exile, he was born in Spain. There, he grew up aware of his belonging to Equatorial Guinea while learning about his family's opposition to colonialism and the successive dictators that have plagued the country since its independence from Spain. His cross-disciplinary research focuses on 19th and 20th century West Central Africa and relies heavily on oral history. His publications include articles and book chapters in English and in Spanish. He has recently completed a book manuscript that explores the development of tradition as an ideological tool to resist the Spanish colonial state in Equatorial Guinea, and is currently working on a new book project that examines transcontinental ties and the human factor behind the involvement of colonized Africans in the anti-colonial nationalist movement. His work also includes media research, having recently hosted a weekly history radio show on one of Jamaica's radio stations. So the title of his talk is The Whites Must Go, Anti-Colonial Sentiments in Equatorial Guinea. And to put some context, just when the colonial masters decided their African subjects would be recognized as Spaniards, Africans in Equatorial Guinea realized this was not enough, and they had to expel the colonizers to be free. It is our pleasure to welcome to Hofstra, Enrique Okenve.
All right. Thank you very much, Veronica. I think you have acknowledged and thanks everybody, but I still want to acknowledge Benita for making this possible, not only for organizing this and hosting the event, but also for hosting me here. Like I'm actually at her place as we speak. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody who has made this possible. It's unfortunate that we cannot make it face to face, right, in person. I think when Veronica mentioned that these are the times, I thought that she was taking us back to COVID times, but no, these are different times and the different circumstances. But be as it may, we are here and we're trying to make the most of it. And let me start by saying that despite the title, nobody should go. Everybody should stay here and listen to what I have to say. So let me set my timer so I don't go over time. Right, and also I'm going to share a PowerPoint, so at least you have some images to follow while I'm doing my presentation. Let me just go and share. All right, I believe it's visible on your screen, correct? All right, so let me start by making a quick reference to the title, The Whites Must Go. The Whites Must Go is sort of a translation from a Fang expression, right, that refers to the different options that colonized Africans in Equatorial Guinea had at the start, almost at the end of the colonial period. Right, and the translation of that expression, it's the whites must go. But the whites has to be understood in a different sense as we will refer to it in most Western languages, because the actual term is midang. Midang is not referring to, it's not a word that refers to phenotype or skin color. It's a term that refers more to the culture of the colonizers and so on. So Midang can be obviously somebody that we can consider a black phenotype or Asian phenotype, but having a Western culture and so on. So at the end of the colonial period, different options were presented, and the one that in a way prevailed, and that's what I want to take you through during this presentation, is that the whites had to leave. They have to go. And just as a way of a quick opening, let me just tell you that colonialism in Africa was a very short episode. Some of you, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with African history, but I suspect most of you are more familiar with the history of colonialism in the Americas, right? Compared to the Americas, colonialism in Africa was a very short episode. We're talking about, give or take, 80, 100 years at most. And this was especially short in Equatorial Guinea. And it was especially short for one of the main groups in Equatorial Guinea, the Fang-speaking communities, the Fang people of today, for which they were the last group to be colonized by the Spaniards, to incorporate it into the colonial system. Right. So as I said, colonialism was very short. I will take you through some of the important dates so you can put that in perspective. Right. And at the time that the anti-colonial movement emerged, it's a little bit paradoxical, because after several decades of subjugation, exploitation by the Spanish, it is after the 1940s when Equatorial Guineans start to benefit from some of the economic growth generated by colonial domination. There's an improvement in material conditions and so on. But regardless of that, it is when we see that the anti-colonial movement grows stronger, right? And we will see a widespread rejection of Spanish domination across most of the ethnic groups and across much of the territory that makes up Equatorial Guinea. So there is a widespread rejection of Spanish presence and domination, especially obvious from the late 1950s and into the 1960s. What did they reject? Well, as I will show you in my presentation, they fundamentally rejected the nature of colonial power, and is a colonial power that was characterized fundamentally by the exclusion of the African majority and the abuses at the hands, or how the extent to which they were abused on numerous occasions by the colonizers, regardless of the character of these colonizers, from the missionaries to the colonial administrators to the plantation owners and so on. There even the nuns, right? There are multiple examples of this type of abuses, and that is basically what they are rejecting. And why they are rejecting it so strongly, especially, as I said, in light of some of the economic benefits that are obvious from the 1950s onwards. I think, and I suspect that part of it has to do with the local political culture, right? There's a local political culture that predated the establishment of Spanish colonial domination in the region. And it also, obviously, they are rejecting colonial power so strongly because of the humiliations that characterize, the humiliating experience that characterize African lives under colonial domination, whether this is Spanish domination in Equatorial Guinea, or French domination in neighboring Gabon or Cameroon. Right? That is, in a sense, why they are rejecting it. But the local political culture, and I will refer to it shortly, it's important. And I'm referring fundamentally to the local political culture of the Fang. That is a political culture characterized by a strong sense of quote unquote sovereignty. Basically, power had to reside within the community. And of course, with colonialism, what we see is that power is taken away from the multiple political communities that existed in the region, and it becomes a monopoly of the European colonizers. Right, and that led to the loss of their cherished autonomy, and of course, the loss of their power. And as I will explain to you, Fang power, the power of Fang leaders, it was quite limited, right? But this was compensated by the strong authority that they commanded over their followers, over the members of their communities. On the other hand, colonial power was unrestrained to a significant extent, and that's why it was rejected. And it was also, it lacked the authority or the legitimacy that previous local power had. And in the end, by the 1960s, what there is the emergence of the anti-colonial movement as an attempt to reconcile power and authority, to bring them together. As I will mention also at the end, this was derailed by other factors after independence. But just to take you a little bit very quickly through some of the history, to put things into context, right? I want to show you a little bit about the early overseas expansion of Europe, to compare it to the very late development of European domination. Here you can see this map that shows you European colonial possessions around like the late 1600s, 17th century. And you can see what is significant is that, of course, as you're familiar with, much of the Americas is already under European domination, a few areas in Asia, but for the most part, most of Africa, except for a few areas on the coast, they are free from European domination. For those of you who are more familiar with Spanish colonial and imperial history, you can see, put things in perspective. Spain, the closest European country to Africa, had no territorial possessions in Africa, except for, of course, the North African enclaves of Ceuta, Melilla, and the Canary Islands that we can't even see on the map. They're not really much or interested at all in the African continent, just like the rest of European powers are not interested on what is happening there. Okay, so fast forward to the late 19th century, and we see the beginning of the so-called scramble for Africa, Europe's scramble for Africa, which I hope some of you may have heard of it, but as the term refers, is basically this sudden rush by Western European nations to occupy, colonize the African continent. You can see on this map, a century and a half before, the European presence in Africa was very limited, with the exception, and this is significant for those of you interested in African history, of course, the southern tip of the continent. That is where the descendants, where the Dutch settlers established themselves from the 1650s. Right, and then they will develop a society very different from the rest of societies that we are going to see elsewhere in the African continent. And of course, these descendants of the Dutch settlers are the ones who later on, a few centuries later, will give rise to the infamous apartheid regime in South Africa. So except for that part and a few areas controlled by the Portuguese, we still have no European presence in the 1700s. But that came to an end at the end of the 1800s, and came to an end for different reasons, right? As I said to you, this is a very late, and I would say ahistorical development. Ahistorical one, because by the time that Europe becomes interested in Africa, most European societies, most Western European societies, have embraced some form of liberal democracies, right? And in a sense, basically the idea of dominating other peoples that have no connection, no ties with you, it's a little bit foreign, and obviously runs contrary to the type of political ideas and political culture that is becoming widespread across much of the Western world. And that's why I say that this scramble for Africa, this sudden rush to colonize African peoples, is a bit of an ahistorical development. Perhaps so ahistorical that it will only last about like 7-8 decades in most cases. As I said to you, we have to understand colonialism, European colonialism in Africa as a very short historical episode in the history of Africa. But as short as it was significant in terms of the extent to which African societies were transformed. We cannot understand modern African societies without understanding what happened to them and how they reacted to colonialism during much of the first half of the 20th century. So very short, but very significant in terms of deeply transforming African societies as we know it today. Right. So the scramble for Africa was almost an afterthought for Europe. And to understand this afterthought, we have to understand what is happening in Europe at the time. We're talking about a Europe in which there is growing competition between the European powers, Western European powers in particular, right? And that competition has a lot to do with the industrialization of European societies, the drive to secure the raw materials to feed the industries in Europe, but also to secure markets. It's a very different type of motivation from the sort of commercial motivations of the previous centuries, where the main purpose or the main idea was to secure the control over commercial networks. Here is the drive is to secure raw materials, and to some extent, indirectly, to also secure markets, to monopolize markets for their respective national economic interests or industrialists, right? And that is what is behind this sudden rush to colonize the African continent. So this, in a way, was also driven or triggered by significant mineral discoveries. I mentioned earlier that the Dutch had established themselves in Southern Africa, in the coastal part of Southern Africa from the 1650s. Long story short, by the 1830s, 40s, these descendants of the Dutch settlers moved into the interior of South Africa. And there, between the 1860s and 1880s, they will discover diamonds and, importantly, gold, the wealthiest or the richest, the biggest gold deposits and mines in the world at the time. And that sort of opened up the eyes of the Europeans who realized, oh, if they had found this in the interior of the continent, there might be other treasures hidden under the African soils, and that, in a way, gave a further boost to their drive to colonize the continent. And that, to avoid the rivalries and the conflict between all of them, they decided to have the conference. It's known as the Berlin Conference in 1884, 1885. And at the Berlin Conference, they decided the terms under which the continent will be carved out and controlled by the different Western European nations. And what is important here is that whatever historical rights certain nations claim to have over the African continent, the fundamental premise of the Berlin Conference was that rights over the African territories will only be recognized if occupation of the territory has been made effective. Without effective occupation, no historical rights will have any value. And that is important because Spain, that tried to convince other European nations that they have historical rights over large portions of the African continent, will not be able to effectively defend those rights under the guise that they had not really made effective the occupation of the African continent. You can see on this map, you can see that how, for example, there is this section in the Gulf of Guinea, which is occupied by Spain. This is the island of Bioko, north of Sao Tome or St. Thomas, as it is here. But there is no real Spanish presence here. And that is the situation in Spain's situation in the late 19th century in Africa. They have control over certain islands of the Gulf of Guinea, the island of Bioko, formerly known as Fernando Po, the island of Annobon, and other small islands off the coast of what is today Equatorial Guinea. Right. By 1914, things would have changed, and we see this pretty much the map. The entire continent has been carved out. In Spain, in yellow, as you can see, There are a few areas on the north and a few areas that square-looking territory in the Gulf of Guinea that is now controlled by Spain. But I will tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. So European occupation of the African continent was a very late development. In the case of Spain, this was even a much later development, that sort of afterthought. Earlier on, I mentioned to you how Spain had control over certain islands. You can see there in pink, those islands are the island of Fernando Po, or otherwise known as Bioko today. And you can see also farther to the southwest, you see the island of Annobon, and a few territories, a small area on the mainland, which is the area of the Moni estuary and the Bay of Corisco. That is all Spain had in the 1890s in this region of the African continent. And what we are going to see that basically Spain will be able to increase their control over the areas or territories in this part of the continent, right? But their claims, their historical claims, and also their claims at the time were not very successful. In Spain, throughout much of the colonial period, throughout much of their history, their presence in Equatorial Guinea, will feel that they had been wronged by their European rivals that were envious of the glorious Spanish past, and this is why they will only grant Spain a very small colony. In a sense, basically, as I said, Spain arrived very late to the quote-unquote party. It's not until the very late 1890s that Spain becomes preoccupied or concerned with making effective their rights over Equatorial Africa, Equatorial Guinea. Right, and that has something to do with what I suspect some of you are aware of, which is the so-called disaster del 98, the 1898 disaster, which is obviously the Spain lost its last overseas colonies, historical colonies, the Philippines, and of course the most important at the time, Cuba. So after that, after losing those colonies, what is left is to try to make effective certain rights in Africa. And well, basically you can see here in the map of Africa, they will manage to make effective their control over what is known as the part of the Moroccan Protectorate, and of course Western Sahara, in the small colony in Equatorial Africa, which is Equatorial Guinea. On the map on your right, you can see that Spain claimed to have much bigger rights or rights over much bigger portions of territory. In the end, in Equatorial Africa, they ended up with a mainland colony of about 26,000 square kilometers, which I think in miles is about 10,000 square miles. Very small, a tiny colony compared to the colonial territories that they had in the past. And of course, tiny compared to other European colonies in the African continent. And as a result of that, we are going to see that Africa or Spain will, especially for the first few decades of the 20th century, was mostly uninterested in their Equatorial African possessions, and felt resentful about how little they were able to gain from the partition of the African continent, and in many ways neglected this colony. In particular, the mainland territory, not so much the island of Bioko, Fernando Po, where most European settlers were established and where they managed to create a very successful cocoa plantation agriculture. But on the mainland, their interest on the mainland, which is where the Fang people live, was negligible. And as a result of that, for most of the colonial period, they neglected the colony. You can see here some important dates. Spain claimed to have these historical rights based on the Treaty of San Ildefonso of 1777, right? But never really made effective even their control over the islands of Bioko and Annobon until 1858. By 1858, they're mostly concentrated on the island of Bioko, or a little bit on Annobon, but that's about it, right? And it's not until 1900 that they managed to convince France to negotiate with them. The Treaty of Paris will be signed, and then is when the mainland territory will be granted to Spain, the small 10,000 square miles that Spain received. As I said, as you can see there, it's also important because the vast majority of the population, of course, of African population live on the mainland territory, known at the time as Rio Muni. And in this territory, the vast majority of the population are Fang speakers. But they live, or most of them live in the interior of Rio Muni. And Spain fundamentally stay on the coast. And it will not be until 1915 that they decided to make effective their control over the inland sections of Rio Muni. And I want to say 1915 here. I want to underscore 1915 because independence came about in 1968. So that is giving you a sense of how short was the period of Spanish domination for most Fang-speaking communities, and yet they were resolute to kick out the Spanish colonizers by the late 1950s, early 1960s. There are some important dates there that you can see. I will refer later on to the Spanish attempts in the late 50s to turn their colony, their Equatorial African colony, into a province. And there will be, of course, resistance by some groups of Western educated and materially successful Africans. And that led in 1959 to the assassination of two notable figures of the early anti-colonial movement, Enrique Okenve and Acacio Meunier. That happened in 1959. A few years later, Spain realized that they could not really hold their African territories, not even under the guise of claiming that they were actually Spanish provinces. By 1968, Equatorial Guinea gained independence. A few months later, 1969, the democratically elected government turned into a dictatorship. That is the Macias Nguema's dictatorship that lasted until 1979, and a new dictatorship followed through. That is the dictatorship of Nguema, which today has control over Equatorial Guinea. So I want to tell you a little bit about the peoples of Equatorial Guinea so you can understand a little bit more why there was such a strong desire to get rid of the Spanish colonizers, why the whites had to go. Equatorial Guinea is supposed to be an ethnically diverse country now, as much of the African colonies and countries, independent nations, they are ethnically diverse in terms of like the cultural groups, linguistic groups that live within the borders that were carved out by the European colonizers. But I have to tell you that in the case of Equatorial Guinea, especially in the case of the mainland, this ethnic diversity tends to be very misleading. You can see there the different groups that live on Equatorial Guinea, or the main group of the island of Bioko is known as the Bubi or Bube, and the main group of the mainland is the Fang. The Fang not only live in Equatorial Guinea, they also live in southern Cameroon and also in northern and central Gabon. And you can see multiple much smaller groups living on the coastal regions of the mainland Equatorial Guinea, or Rio Muni at the time, right? But one thing that you have to keep in mind is that today this map is not very accurate because groups are way more mixed. And for example, there are significant number of Fang people who live on the island of Bioko, and of course, many Fang people also live on the coastal area. So there is this is more like a map of what the situation would have been like at the end of the 19th century or early 20th century, not what is the reality today. But the reality is that about 86% of the population in Equatorial Guinea are Fang speakers. And that is why I said to you that the diversity of Equatorial Guinea is sort of misleading, right? Because it is by any standard is a very homogeneous country, even by Western European standards, is a rather homogeneous country. But I keep referring to them as Fang speakers, right? And I will tell you in a short while why, right? But there are nonetheless there are other groups that are important to keep in mind. Of course, the Bubi on the island. There are other groups, smaller groups, but influential groups during the colonial era on the coast, the Benga, the Kombe, and so on. The so-called the Europeans refer to the coastal groups that are very diverse and very mixed, but also very small. They put them together under one single label, and they refer to them as playeros, the beach people. And the term that they have adopted in recent decades to refer to themselves is Ndowe, which is that term that brings together groups that are not exactly linguistically the same, but because they're so small, they seek to create a sense of unity, and the label is very convenient. It's still a small group, and as I said, it is fundamentally the Fang speakers and also to some extent the Bubi who make up the majority of the Equatorial Guinea population. And that has implications because in many ways during the colonial era, and of course, especially after the colonial era, Fang political culture has shaped first the resistance to colonial domination, and later on the ways in which like the country has evolved politically. I refer to Fang people as Fang speakers because I have to tell you that at the end of the 19th century and even during the first few decades of the 20th century, Fang people or Fang speakers did not consider themselves a single homogeneous ethnic group. There was no sense of common ethnicity in terms of like, or if there was a sense of, yes, of course, people had a sense that they share the same culture with people from other parts of the territory and so on, but that wasn't meaningful in any way. There were other things that were way more meaningful to explain social relations in the territory. And for example, on the coast, you might find Fang speakers who have very close relations with the non-Fang speakers who live there and so on. So during the first half of the 20th century, Fang ethnicity is in a way like it's culturally significant, but at the social and political level, it doesn't really have much significance. But there are some elements of the political culture that you have to be aware of. One of it is that Fang political culture is characterized by a strong sense of the importance of political autonomy. How we organize ourselves were in what we call voivod, or the small village communities. These were villages made of relatives who were related through paternal lines, right? And they were independent from all the village communities and so on. So we're talking about, in some cases, political communities of maybe 200 people, 500 people at best. It depends on which parts of the Fang-speaking territory we're talking about. And each of them had a very strong sense of their importance of their political autonomy, right? And that is important, that is crucial, because that's precisely what they will lose with the beginning of the European incursion, with the beginning of the European takeover of this region of Africa. So, as I said, these Fang-speaking communities live in southern Cameroon, northern and central Gabon, and of course, most of what is mainland Equatorial Guinea. These communities were led oftentimes by elders, especially like family elders, right? And as I said, there was no common authority beyond these small village communities or communities of relatives. However, they managed to maintain strong cooperation, which was needed in many cases, and usually it is through clan affiliation. Small village communities or small communities of relatives who belong to the same clan, and by belonging to the same clan, meaning that they identify to have a common distant ancestor, tend to have a strong sense of belonging, and as a result of that, there was significant cooperation within the clan. But there were also other ways of cooperating with other groups, even if they were not related by blood, because there were all sorts of social exchanges, right? Especially through marital alliances. Marriage is the main mechanism that serves to create this cooperation. So as I said, no strong sense of political unity, or no sense of political unity, but a strong sense of the value of their political autonomy. And that's precisely what they will be resisting throughout much of the colonial domination, because they tried to resist the loss of their cherished political autonomy. And what they were resistant fundamentally? Well, I'm showing you here these are images of Bere, which are some these statues that were used during the cult of it's a religious celebration called Malan, right? Which is basically something that had to do with the ancestors, and the elders were in control of these rituals and so on. And anyway, it was also a manifestation of the strong sense of family unity, and as I said, also family belonging. But going back to what it is that they're resisting, what they're resisting is fundamentally the legitimate power of Spain in Equatorial Guinea. The legitimate power. Why was it so illegitimate? First of all, because the Spaniards or the Spanish were not members of their community. Power had to rest in the hands of one of us, a member of our village community, a member of our community of relatives. And of course, Spanish were not members of any of those communities. But there were other fundamental and practical reasons why Spain's political power was illegitimate. It was illegitimate because, of course, Spain created an order of legal discrimination in which Africans were considered to be uncivilized. And as a result of that, they had a much lower legal and social status. It was all kinds of form of discrimination on the basis of our so-called lack of civilization. And as a result of that, of course, any Spaniard, regardless of the level of education, will be considered civilized and with all sort of rights, privileges, and so on. So that is one of the fundamental things that colonized Africans will resist against. European domination, Spanish domination in Equatorial Guinea was characterized by the privileges that all Europeans enjoyed vis-a-vis their colonized Africans, but also, as I referred earlier, also all types of abuses of all kinds. And we'll say physical abuses in terms of violence, in particular, exercised against men and women, sexual violence as well, abuses in terms of the economic negotiations or the lack of economic negotiations, economic impositions, and so on. And in the midst of all these abuses, what we say is that the Europeans enjoy impunity. The colonial masters, the administrators, will never punish. There were numerous instances of so-called legitimate but also illegitimate violence, and even when the violence was not sanctioned formally by the state, those who carry out or conducted this type of violence will never be punished. And one of the things that we know is that the colonial state in the Spanish colonial state, it was very weak. And as a result of that, they had to rely on the military muscle. So the colonial guard were the administrators, but also the enforcers of colonial authority across much of Spanish Equatorial Guinea. And you can see there, of course, the Spanish presence was limited, so they had to rely on Africans to join the colonial guard. Obviously, the officials, the officers were always Spanish officials, right? And not only was weak in terms of lack of administrative resources, is also that they didn't even have an ability to control much of the territory, and they had to rely on middlemen, and those middlemen would be chiefs. So local leaders, in some cases, they were not previously recognized as local leaders, will be appointed by the Europeans. They will receive the term of the label of jefes de tribu, whatever the case might be, and they will serve as middlemen between the European colonizers, the European administrators who commanded over them, and it's these chiefs that basically managed to their function was to spread or to serve as go-between the colonial administrators and the African communities. As I said there, in this context, there are contexts of privileges, and images like these were quite common, in which Africans obviously will have to serve whites in ways that will recognize the superior status of the white people. Right. So that is some of the ways that we see that characterize the Spanish colonial power that not only Fang, but other ethnic groups in Equatorial Guinea rejected. They also rejected the extractive economy of Spain. Extractive economy from, of course, hunting that characterized the early moments of a Spanish presence in the region, right? But also in the mainland, fundamentally extractive economies were dominated by the extraction of timber. Equatorial Guinea is covered by the rainforest, and whereas we didn't have many settlers establishing themselves on the mainland, what we see is the rise of different timber companies that will, on the coastal areas, will extract the large trees. This economy require also the construction of infrastructures, and this construction infrastructure had to be carried out by Africans who were compelled to provide on a regular basis what the Spanish called prestación personal, which was a form of cover labor. Every community had to provide an X amount of workers on a regular basis to build the infrastructure and maintain the infrastructure of the colonizers. And of course, the roads was the first of this infrastructure because it served to not only to extend the power of the state, but also to facilitate the extraction of the local resources. But perhaps the most significant element of the colonial economy, extractive economy, is the cocoa plantation system on the island, the rich soils of Bioko, fertile volcanic soils, and there's where we see the development of this cocoa plantation. I say this is important because the Bubi people, the indigenous people of the island, in a way, they were the ones closer to the European colonizers. I did not mention, sorry, that the colonial capital was established on the island of Bioko or Fernando Po, but also, as I mentioned earlier, this is where we see the development of these cocoa plantation plantations. In a sense, basically, this was possible by depriving the indigenous Bubi population of their land. Contrary to what is happening on the mainland, where there is not a significant European presence and Africans are able to keep access to land, that is not what happened on the island. On the island, the Bubi population lost significant access to land, and that was obviously the objective of that was to contribute to the development of the cocoa plantation agriculture on the island. And finally, what are they rejecting? They're also rejecting the so-called civilizing mission of Spain. So-called civilizing mission, because what Spain is doing is, as I mentioned earlier, their political domination and over Equatorial Guineans, over Africans in Equatorial Guinea, is predicated on the basis of their uncivilized character. And basically what this civilizing mission first had to do is to decivilize Africans, deny any sense of cultural value, right? So at the same time that the missioners and all the colonial agents are empowering their own culture, they are denigrating Africans' culture. The culture first of the Bubi in particular, on the island where the Bubi are going to be denied access to their land. And later on, when they expand into the mainland, the Fang. And I will talk more about it tomorrow at the talk that I'm going to give, because there is what we're going to see, that the Fang will be identified as the archetypical, the prototypical African primitive, and so on. So European domination was rested on the basis, on the notion that Africans were primitive and civilized, with cultures that had no value whatsoever, and they needed to be transformed. They needed to be civilized. And this is an example in this photograph. If I'm not mistaken, this is a photograph of Fang people from the mainland that were taken to Banapa on the island of Bioko, to go to school, to the missionary station there, where they will learn the ways of the white, so to speak. An important elements of this civilization, or so-called civilization, of course, is evangelization. Spain, Roman Catholic country, a significant emphasis was given to the conversion of Africans. Not much success, to be honest, during the first, on the mainland in particular, not much success during the first few decades of the 20th century. More significant success on the island of Bioko because of the longer presence of the missionaries there, and because the missionaries play this role of being kind of some kind of I think the term today now is that white savior, but that is exactly what they did, because basically once the Bubi had been conquered and later on they had been deprived of their land, the missionaries came to quote unquote rescue and provided them with the type of protection that facilitated the conversion of the Bubi to Roman Catholicism. On the mainland, especially among Fan communities, the process was slower. But as everywhere else in Africa, they focus fundamentally on children and women, and this will be the first one that will be converted. So the missionaries play a significant role as agents of European colonial power, Spanish colonial power, and so on. The success of this will, over the decades, lead to even the development of to the rise of African priests. We'll see the participation in religious processions like this, right? And education included, of course, making African women to develop, I guess, I can't remember, I don't know exactly how to translate, but there's a term in Spanish called las labores propias de su sexo. So it's basically doing what a woman is supposed to be doing. So embroidering and so on. You can see here. The boys are in the classroom learning, I'm not sure exactly what they're learning there, under the tutelage of the Spanish, but it seems to be a missionary, and the women here seem to be learning to iron clothes and stuff like that. Later on, during the Franco era, this civilization will include, of course, ideological indoctrination into the ways of the Francoist ultra-Catholic regime. And then by the end of the colonial era is when we see that the whites must go. Right? So that's the term that was used. And as I will mention to you, as mentioned earlier to you, these were the options that were given to that colonized Africans had at the end of the colonial era. At the end of the colonial era, of course, Equatorial, and I'm almost done. At the end of the colonial era, Equatorial Guineans could have chosen to remain as part of Spain. It's a Spanish province, right? Which is what Equatorial Guinea became from 1956 and especially from 1959. But they rejected that. But there was also another possibility, which is to maintain a relationship with the former colonial power, in which like the former colonial power could serve as sort of overseer or guidance or counselor or something like that. A little bit like the French decolonization model, in which like France supervises their former colonial territories, or the other option is that the whites, the Mitan, had to go completely leave the country, not physically per se, but leave anything that had to do with the administration of the state and power structures in the country. So the anti-colonial sentiments, as much as I have spoken about Fang people, their political culture, what is very clear from the developments of the late 1950s is that these anti-colonial sentiments are spread across, they're shared across ethnic lines and boundaries. What you see in the late 1950s is that Fang people are collaborating with groups in the island of Bioko, with the so-called Bubi, with the so-called Creole or Fernandinos. They're also collaborating with the coastal peoples, the so-called Ndowe, and so on. And these sentiments is because Spain never succeeded to legitimize its power. It was continuously resisted in different ways, sometimes more open, sometimes more overt, right? And sometimes more subtle. But Spain never managed to make the power legitimate in the eyes of Africans. There was, of course, initially unsuccessful armed resistance, but after they realized that they could not actually fight the European armies and the firepower of the Europeans, they created other forms of resistance that were relatively effective. And we see all forms of resistance from the early 1930s among educated people, but also in rural communities, particularly in farm rural communities, we see other forms of resistance through cultural reaffirmation. And from the late 1930s, and especially from the late 1940s, we are going to see that educated Africans, and these are the people, Africans who were more successful in the colony, the ones who are benefiting the most, they're becoming increasingly politically conscious. And from the late 1940s, they start organizing different protest actions. And from the mid-1950s, they will organize an underground anti-colonial movement. And it is this movement that will lead to the death of the two early leaders. I'm showing you here a document that is for an example of what they are resisting against. This document is speaking about the death of an African at the hands of an European, and they are requesting that this is investigated and those responsible are brought to justice. Of course, nothing of that happened. So we will see that people in very influential leaders on the coast, like Santiago Uganda, of the Benga ethnic group, will in the late 1940s will write letters to General Franco. Failing that, he also wrote a letter to the United Nations denouncing the situation, the nature of Spanish power in Equatorial Guinea and the treatment of Africans. By the mid to late 1950s, we'll see the development of this more organized anti-colonial movement that led, once the Spanish administrators realized what was going on, they will repress this movement severely. And the two main leaders, or two, I'm not sure if they can be characterized as the two main leaders, but two significant leaders of this movement, Akasi Munye and Enrique Okenve, you can see here, they were assassinated under unclear circumstances. I say under unclear circumstances because in the case of Enrique Okenve, you can see this map here. It's where the Spanish tried to investigate how he had moved across the bordering territory of Cameroon and identifying where he died. Right, so there are colonial documents that tell us a little bit the circumstances of the death, but of course we are still investigating this. So by mid to late 1960s, the anti-colonial movement has managed to succeed and basically force the Spanish colonizers, the Spanish administrators to grant independence, to open a process of negotiation that will lead to the independence of the nation, first the drafting of a constitution, and later the independence of the country. And these two figures here represent the two options. These are two frontmen, Ondoedu on your left, Matthias Ngema on your right. These two leaders represent the different options. Ondoedu represents the option of maybe independence under Spanish tutelage or guidance versus Matthias Ngema, who represents independence with total sovereignty for Equatorial Guineans, and Spain perhaps playing a marginal role, not necessarily expelling the Spaniards, but removing them from any power structure in the country. So as I said, in the end, Equatorial Guineans, the majority of Equatorial Guineans voted for Macias, the most radical of the two candidates. And long story short, within 5 months, he turned his democratic government into one of the most infamous dictatorships on the African continent during the 1970s, with almost a third of the population fleeing the country, thousands of people assassinated, and so on and so forth. So these two successive dictators, and this was succeeded by his relative, Obia Ngema, who's still in power. These two successive dictatorships basically derail our dreams and aspirations, the dreams and aspirations that Equatorial Guineans had at the time of independence. All right, and I think that's it. I think I went a little bit over time, but I hope not too long. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to having discussion with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Enrique. I want to open up the floor to especially students who are in the room. I think it's important to engage with them as much as possible. So I want to open it up to students first, and then we can sort of carry on a conversation. Questions, comments?
They might still be processing. I took them through, I think, about 1,500 years, or no, 500 years of history in just a few minutes.
I know, and it was brilliant. Thank you for that. And I think we can't underscore just the humiliation and the brutality of colonialism and how it manifested itself in so much of the African continent. And everything that you were talking about reminds me of my homeland in Kenya, and how much, while it was such a short period in history, how much it just impacted people up into this day in many aspects of life. And I guess I had one question just to kind of start things off. You talked about the Fang people as being having no sense of a common ethnicity, but a similar culture, a strong sense of political autonomy. Would you relate that in any way to what it means to be, say, an American, however you want to define that, or is it something very different from that?
I was going to say, I hope it's very different, but
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I can't really answer, that because, but no, I think it's, I can't say so much about American, but I'm obviously I come from, I have been living in Jamaica for the past almost 20 years. My wife is Jamaican, so are my children. I can relate it to a little bit to that because in a way it's basically these kinds of new societies emerging in the so-called new world and so on. It's different because there's a sense of historical continuity, connections, cultural connections of all sort of things, social connections of all sort of things, all sort of types, and also they kind of belonging to this space in which you live. So there's no sense of being removed from your space and so on. So I think it's very different. And obviously there are no differences of that type. I use the term mitang, and mitang is not per se a racial term. I mean, even those divisions that are created by Europeans upon arriving in the Americas and establishing the type of political and social political order and so on that created these clearly delineated differences. Those things still are visible across the Americas, not just the United States, North, South, in the Caribbean, and so on. That is very different from the reality that we find not just in Equatorial Guinea, I would say in other African territories. Maybe the similarity has more to do with South Africa.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Just to kind of open things up.
Mm-hmm.
I see some hands. I see Lucy and then Adam. We'll start there. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, let my camera real quick. Hey Enrique, it was a very good talk. You might recognize me on the Son of Lucia. I have two questions actually. They're both about the difference between the island and the mainland. The first one is, was there any main differences between the Spanish administration between the mainland and the island, especially to the 50, 100 years of colonial, yeah. Are there any main differences in Spanish administration? And if there was, could you point them out and highlight them, please?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, there are significant differences from the administrative point of view, but also from the economic point of view. And the differences, of course, is that once you are the administrative power was located on the island, and that granted European administrators greater efficiency at controlling societies, right? Because colonial domination is not just established through the role of the administrators. Everybody is collaborating in different ways. The missionaries, the settlers, the plantation owners, and so on. So the level of control that you can see on the island, it's significantly stronger than the level of European control on the mainland. The sense of loss on the island of the indigenous people is also more severe on the island. So and on the mainland, for example, except for the coastal region, colonized Africans will tell you that they will see a European, a white person, once in a blue moon, right? So it's totally different. on the mainland, fundamentally, is the colonial guards. That's the visible presence of the colonial state, and the colonial guards are agents of violence, by the way, even when they are African colonial guards. They are exercising that violence, and they're making people feel that violence and that type of power.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Just very, very, very quick. Do you feel like those created any difference in ideologies between, residents of the mainland and the island?
Yeah. I think that is a fantastic question, because I mentioned that in the beginning of the anti-colonial movement, there is cooperation across ethnic lines. And the big question, and this is what some of my colleagues and I myself are trying to investigate, is what happened to that. One of my colleagues, Gonzalo Alvarez Chirida, has his own theory, but basically the idea is that in the early 1960s, once the Spaniards realized that they're not going to be able to fully control this anti-colonial movement, they're trying to divide the anti-colonial movement, and they are much more effective at, I would say, manipulating those who had been under more intense contact with the Europeans, the Boer population, of course, but also some of the coastal groups. So that is where I will see that the FAM remain much more opposed much more opposed to any form of colonial or Spanish or European interference than other groups. So I think that is part of it. And right after independence, when things derail completely, those differences, ethnic differences, will become more visible, because the power now is in the hand of a person who happens to be FAM. And the vast majority of the FAN are going to be identified as the holders of power, even though they are also suffering the nature of the dictatorial power that came about from 1969 onwards.
I think Adam was next, and then Bianca.
Okay, I guess it's more of a comment. I feel like you were too neutral when discussing like the colonial power becoming an overseer and a guide of the state. That's not a thing. That's a grift invented to maintain colonial power in an age of post-colonialism, right? That's what the French are doing in Africa. Is not like benevolent and good. It's really, they're just exploiting it, and they're using the CFA franc, which is pegged directly to the euro, to control their monetary policy, right? And I think that acting like it's just an option, it's not an option. It's not an option at all. It's just a continuation of control. The only way for a colonial entity to be free, truly free, is to kick them all out.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's good that you make that point, because it allows me to sort of qualify what I said. You have to understand. I mean, I'm a historian, so I have to look at things as they were in 1966, 67, 68, and not as they turned out to be, or rather, how things were presented to them. So the option that was presented to them is that, and this is what Ondoedu is saying, is that we can maintain a close relationship with Spain and we will benefit because we are not quite ready for the challenges of independence. That is the option that is presented to people. Whether that option is accurate or not is a totally different thing. And of course, people realize that many people didn't believe that was an accurate representation. And that's why they voted for the other candidate, just because they didn't like that option or they didn't find it convincing either. But what I was just trying to say is that how this option was being presented to them. The fact that they rejected, I think, is very significant, and that's what we have seen. But by the way, for other different reasons, that we don't have time to discuss, choosing that option, especially choosing that candidate, Mrs. Ngema, created a completely set of new problems, some of which we are still paying for.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bianca, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. I really enjoyed that discussion, so thank you for that. My family is from the Philippines, and I do know that a lot, like co the colonial history between people that were colonized by Spain um share a lot of similarities. So I just wanted to kind of like tie in what you were discussing with like my own country's background because I just I don't know, I just noticed a lot of similarities. There was one similarity in the way that uh, the Filipinos under Spanish colonial rule kind of treated um the colonizers being in their country because but there also were some differences. But um in the Philippines there was a social caste created by the Spanish, and I found it interesting while I was like researching that the Spaniard, like the upper class Filipinos wanted the Spaniards out, but they also wanted to preserve that social caste because it was in their best interest to kick the Spaniards out so they'd gain power. So
Yeah.
it's reminiscent of like fighting this war for a good that doesn't actually hold any benefit for the majority of people in the country. I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think because I have not really thought, of course, and the Philippines is an interesting example because again, we're dealing with a society compared to the Americas is different. I mean, you have fundamentally indigenous peoples being colonized there without the arrival of new sets of people from other parts of the world. Like we don't have a large Spanish population moving to the Philippines, and of course, we don't have a African enslaved population, or at least not a sizable
Yeah,
one, being moved there. So in some ways, it has more to do with the kind of relationship established in Equatorial Guinea, obviously at a different time. But what you said, I think, is correct because what is it that, yeah, they want to get rid of the European rulers, but do they want to get rid of some of the cultural transformations and institutions that the European rulers have brought? No, I don't think that was the case. I, and you see, I'm saying this with a caveat because the death of those two figures, Acacio Magne and especially Enrique Okenve, I have been reading some of the documents that this Enrique Okenve wrote. He was very politically savvy in terms of like his level of understanding of what colonialism had done to him and of course by extension to the rest of the African population. Uh, and in a way, we lost that talent when he was assassinated. It may have been different, but their successors never really questioned many of these institutions, never really questioned the culture, the religion, and the political institutions and so on. They were maintained. It was more, and it has become more about replacing the rulers, right? And that
yeah.
is perhaps the sad part of it. Yeah.
There's also like this illusion of unification that I kind of see, especially in the Philippines, because before the Spanish came to the islands, the Philippines was broken up into tribes and the
Mm.
Philippines didn't exist. So it was just a bunch of groups of different people living together on one island, or like one group of islands because it's an archipelago.
Mhm.
But there was this, but the Spaniards kind of dissolved that tradition and unified the groups. So now there's like Tagalog people, there's Cebuanos and
Mhm.
Visayans, um, to easier control the islands because the Spaniards obviously didn't want the Filipinos to learn Spanish, but they learned Tagalog to
Mhm.
write articles about and like make a Bible in their language so they could convert the natives to Christianity. So I felt that was also kind of reminiscent of what you were talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it reminds me that, or it's letting me know that I have to read more about the history of the Philippines, so I can sort of understand put some of the things that I've been talking about in and put them in perspective because obviously it is the same colonizing nation, although a different time, and it will be good to read more about it. So thank you for your comments and it's food for thought.
Yes, Gio, unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your presentation. In my course, we're talking about colonization in Latin America and the spread of Christianity and how Christianity and Christian beliefs kind of intertwined with the indigenous beliefs. So could you like talk about how like instances of that happening in Africa during this colonization period? If there
Yeah.
are.
But that is a topic for another talk, because there is a lot to say about it. But what I will say is that it just depends on the on which part of the, and I suspect it's the same in the Americas, because there are indigenous societies that are more exposed to colonial power than others, and in Equatorial Guinea we see the same thing, right? But there is an element of syncretism, sometimes not so much in their rituals, which there is, right? In the region that I'm talking about, there is, for example, a religious spiritual ritual, I would say, it's called Buti, that comes from the south, from Gabon, and spread across much of the coastal part of Rio Muni and the southern part of the mainland Equatorial Guinea. And is very syncretic in terms of the sets of beliefs and the rituals and so on. But even when we don't see that kind of clear syncretism, like in Catholicism, people who consider themselves Catholic, they maybe not so much. I would have to say I'm not so sure so much about the current generations, but earlier generations, like my grandparents' generation, there's that level of a spiritual syncretism. One of the things that colonizers and missionaries in particular complain about is the character of God. How in most Central African religions, God, the creator, is a very distant figure that doesn't really matter. Yes, he is responsible for having arranged the world as it is, but doesn't really have an effect on earthly matters, on individuals or on families or groups or anything like that. It is the ancestors who can intercede on your behalf, but God is that kind of distant figure. And many people will convert to Christianity and still will not believe this idea that there's an omnipresent God that is looking at every single aspect of your life. And I always tell people the example of my grandfather, who considered himself a Roman Catholic, but at the same time he had 3 wives. And when you ask him, how come you're a Roman Catholic but you have 3 wives, he will say, well, what does have got to do with this, right? I mean, one thing is marriage, or how you live, and another thing is God. So to me, that is kind of like an example of that kind of sort of different spiritual traditions and that kind of syncretism. So one thing doesn't deny the other, because I think it's also nature of many religions that don't belong to the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic tradition, in which like they incorporate influences from all kinds of spiritual traditions. So to people like my father and so on, that would be only natural that you also adopt Christianity, but it is transformed and adopted.
I think that's a very good point. I always think about religious syncretism as a form of resistance, really. Like, you're just not going to accept every aspect of Roman Catholicism or, Christianity in general.
Mm-hmm.
I feel as though colonized people take what is meaningful, how they can sort of incorporate in society. I feel like it's a religious and also political endeavor. That's always been
absolutely.
sort of how I've been. How I see it. My grandfather had multiple wives, and he was, very Christian man, and you can't deny that. You can't take that away from him, but being indoctrinated and being introduced to Christianity, it just manifests itself in different spaces. It depends on, which church might have come into your village and community and how that
exactly.
sort of, So we have 10 minutes left, but I do want to make sure that we get questions and comments in the room.
I'm not looking at the chat. I'm not sure if there's any question there on the chat.
I will just say one person, Star, said, I appreciate how in-depth Enrique went over the colonial period in Africa. So that was appreciative. It's always good to have that context to start the discussion, because I think it's safe to say, at least in the global north, oftentimes the experiences across the African diaspora are least understood. So it's always good to have that historical context. And so that is greatly appreciated. And
All right,
I always
thanks.
think the repetition and hearing it over and over is a reminder of, yes. Oh, great. Simon and then Josu.
Well, actually, maybe Josue would like to go first, because I think we should prioritize the students.
Thank you. So my question is, well, we were talking about, you know, religions and stuff. So how does the interplay between traditional spiritual beliefs in Equatorial Guinea and like the modern political ideologies shape the strategies and like outcomes of anti-colonial movements?
Well, that's a big question. Let me say that in terms of the anti-colonial movements, I'm not really aware of much of that sort of like synergy between, and I think it's an important thing because in a way, there is, and I was talking to somebody like, there is of course the belief, there is a kind of shared belief in ideas of witchcraft, and by witchcraft, I'm talking about the sort of like negative manipulation of spiritual forces for somebody's benefit, right? That is what, in a sense, in our Central African sort of culture, witchcraft is considered, is the manipulation of spiritual forces for one's own selfish interest. Not if it's a manipulation for the benefit of the community, that will not be considered witchcraft. But however, that was not part of the. I don't think that was part of the anti-colonial resistance, and I think, in a way, it's also because I can't speak because I don't really know so much about other cultural traditions in Equatorial Guinea, but in terms of the fact, there is a kind of pragmatic approach to reality in which like people separate and compartmentalize, right? And in that sense, people didn't think that sort of spirituality will be part of it. However, things did change considerably with independence, because what we are going to see with independence is all kinds of different things. But one of the things that is going to happen is, yes, some of these members of the dictatorial regimes, of the political regimes, and so on, they will manipulate, they will play this kind of like role of being involved in the manipulation of the spiritual forces, and they will attend all kinds of like religious ceremonies and so on, which they at the same time, by the way, they also go to church on Sunday, right? But on a Friday night, they will attend like maybe one like some kind of healing ritual session and things like that. That has happened because I think in a way, there has been an attempt to sort of like solidify their power by convincing them that not only do they have the material power on their behalf, but they also have some sort of spiritual power. Right, so that type of manipulation has happened more. I think has become more influential during the post-colonial era, and yeah, it is very much present. I had not, unfortunately, I had not been to Equatorial Guinea for the last few years, because somebody asked me about it the other day, and I didn't want to say for sure, because I know it's been 5 years or so now, and I know that some of these things do change very rapidly. So I don't know what the situation is right now, but for sure I can tell you that during the 1990s and early part of the 2000s, you will see a lot of this kind of manipulation of so-called spiritual powers and so on. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it is a very big question. It is a question that actually will force me to think way more about it before I can answer properly. Yeah.
So maybe at this point, if I could just jump in, you showed a very striking picture, Enrique, of Ghanaian football players doing
yes.
the salutes. And it reminded me of the way in which football, soccer in Spain itself was also co-opted by the Franco regime, by the dictatorship in Spain, to promote its own, ideology. And I suppose one question I was thinking about was whether there were any opponents of Franco, any people on the left who also agreed that the whites should go. Was there any kind of equivalent, let's say, I mean, I'm asking partly on the behalf of students, but also from my own point of view, was there any equivalent to the abolitionist movement? Was there any anti-colonial movement from white European people, white Spanish people?
Yeah. I would say yes, and that much is clearly in the early 1930s, late 1920s, early 1930s. In particular, there's a group of people who are leftists, almost anarchist, and there's some level of collaboration. And some letters, some protest letters are published in Catalonian. I think is some my bachelor's are in law, so hopefully we'll connection. But some articles protesting the situation in Equatorial Guinea are published in Catalonian newspapers, and some of these newspapers are of leftist orientation. Some of them are even anarchist orientation. And then there's a interesting thing, because one of the first organized sort of like actions in 1937, 38, it was an attempt by Enrique Okenve that I mentioned earlier, and other
somebody look at it. Yeah, I like it.
Oh, do we lose Enrique? Maybe he'll come back.
That's a significant loss.
We'll give him a moment. I know the time is coming to a close, but we want to make sure. Hopefully, we can regroup.
Hello.
Oh,
Yes, Enrique has returned under an
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
using you may see a different name here, but it's me. Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, I was saying that in 1937, 38, right? There is this attempt to collect money to hire an attorney in Spain, and the idea is that they wanted to be represented by an attorney in Spain to speak on behalf of them, because they were afraid that the Spanish administrators now under Franco was going to take the land from native land from them, basically. And these were rumors that had been spread by those sympathizers of the Republican regime as they were living in Equatorial Guinea, right, mainland Equatorial Guinea. As they were living in mainland Equatorial Guinea, they were spreading the rumors that the Francoist people, the followers of Francisco Franco, were going to take everything away from them, and so on. So there are those attempts, and I think there are other examples in which it's happening, but after the 1930s, I think it's a little bit harder. I mean, after 1940s, once Franco has solidified, and the Franco regime has solidified its power, it's a little bit harder for anybody to sort of try to collaborate with locals. But there is also, I mean, there are some instances in which we see that there are some sort of connections, but I think that's a part that we still have to investigate more.
Thank you.
thank you. It looks like our time is just about to end.
No.
I would love to keep talking for on and on. Someone said no. There was a question in the chat about the availability of this recording. I'm not sure how that's working out, but I don't know if Benita, if you know of any way to do that, or
I think the event has been recorded and it will go on the YouTube page of Hofstra University. Yes.
Great. So it'll be available at the YouTube page at some point. I'm sure we have a list of people who are present. We can let that be known because I know not everyone is a Hofstra student or administrator here. So we will definitely make that known. Want to thank Enrique Okenve once again and Benita San Pedro Vizcaya for organizing this amazing conversation. It has been powerful and meaningful. And I hope that we take what we learned today and have a broader understanding of our world around us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
Enrique.
you.
Appreciate it, boss man.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Enrique.
Take care, guys.